Hi everyone, welcome to The Witch's Book, Dark Tales. If you enjoy this video, like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we see you on the other side. For centuries, popular traditions and folk tales have served as a window into the human soul, revealing our deepest fears, hopes, and attempts to understand the world around us. However, not all of these stories were well received by religious authorities. Many myths and legends were considered dangerous, blasphemous, or simply incompatible with the official teachings of the Church. This article explores some of the most fascinating folkloric stories that were censored, banned, or considered heretical by the Church throughout history. From ancient pagan deities that were demonized to popular rituals that were suppressed, we will discover how folklore often came into conflict with established religious doctrine. The roots of conflict: paganism versus Christianity. To understand why certain folkloric stories were considered problematic, it is essential to understand the historical context in which these tensions arose. When Christianity spread across Europe, Africa, and other parts of the world, it did not encounter a religious vacuum. On the contrary, it encountered deeply rooted belief systems that had existed for millennia. The ancient Celts venerated nature gods like Cernunnos, the horned god of fertility and hunting. Germanic peoples honored Odin, Thor, and a vast array of Norse deities. In the Mediterranean region, mystery cults dedicated to figures like Dionysus and Mithras competed with early Christian communities. These traditions did not disappear overnight when Christian missionaries arrived in their lands. Instead, a complex process of syncretism, resistance, and eventual suppression occurred. Many pagan elements of folklore were incorporated into Christian traditions, transformed to fit the new dominant faith. Others were completely rejected and labeled as diabolical or heretical. Celtic legends, the banished gods. Celtic traditions were particularly targeted by the early church. The Druids, who served as priests, judges, and guardians of knowledge in Celtic society, were systematically persecuted. Their ritual practices, which included sacrifices in sacred groves and the veneration of trees, stones, and bodies of water, were denounced as demon worship. One of the most controversial figures in the Celtic pantheon was Cernunnos, often depicted as a man with deer antlers, symbolizing the connection between humanity and nature. For the Celts, he represented fertility, abundance, and the eternal cycle of life and death. However, for Christian missionaries, his horned appearance was unmistakably diabolical. Cernunnos was gradually transformed into the popular image of the Christian devil, complete with horns and associations with carnal temptation. Stories about the Celtic otherworld, a magical realm where the dead continued their lives in an idealized form, also conflicted with Christian doctrines about the afterlife. According to Celtic mythology, heroes and common people could travel to this realm through special mounds, lakes, or during certain times of the year. These beliefs were seen as a direct threat to Christian teachings about heaven, hell, and purgatory. The legend of Brigid, one of the most beloved goddesses of the Celtic pantheon, presents an interesting example of how the Church dealt with popular figures that could not be completely suppressed. Brigid was venerated as goddess of poetry, healing, smithcraft, and protection. Recognizing her popularity, the Church transformed her into Saint Brigid, maintaining many of her original attributes, but framing her within the Christian structure. Witches and the Great Persecution. Perhaps no aspect of folklore was more brutally suppressed than traditions related to witchcraft. What we now understand as witchcraft was, in many cases, a continuation of ancient folk healing practices, fertility rituals, and spiritual connection with nature. Witches were often local healers, midwives, and knowledgeable herbalists.
They preserved oral traditions dating back to pre-Christian times, including seasonal rituals, protective invocations, and divinatory practices. These women, and occasionally men, served rural communities where access to trained doctors and clergy was limited. The transformation of these traditional practices into malevolent witchcraft was a gradual process that reached its peak during the 15th to 17th centuries. The famous witch-hunting manual, Malleus Maleficarum, or Hammer of Witches, published in 1487, codified many popular superstitions about witches into a pseudo-theological doctrine that justified mass persecutions. Folk stories about night flights, animal transformations, and sabbatic gatherings were reinterpreted as evidence of diabolic pacts. Healing rituals involving herbs and incantations were denounced as black magic. The very figure of the wise woman, an older woman who possessed knowledge about medicinal plants and local traditions, became synonymous with evil and corruption. A particularly tragic example of this transformation can be seen in traditions related to witch flight. Many European cultures had legends about women who could travel spiritually during sleep, visiting other worlds, or communicating with spirits. These stories, which originally spoke of shamanic powers and spiritual journeys, were distorted into forced confessions of physical flights to diabolic meetings. Dragons and serpents, demonized symbols. Dragons occupy a special place in world mythology, appearing in cultures as diverse as Chinese, Norse, and Mesoamerican. In pre-Christian European tradition, dragons were often associated with wisdom, protection, and telluric forces. They guarded treasures, not only of gold, but of ancestral knowledge. The serpent equally was a powerful symbol in many ancient traditions. For the Celts, serpents represented renewal and healing due to their ability to shed their skin. In ancient Greek medicine, the serpent was associated with Asclepius, the god of healing, symbolism that persists today in the medical caduceus. However, with the rise of Christianity, both dragons and serpents were systematically demonized. The serpent of the Garden of Eden became the archetype of tempting evil, and all other serpentine symbols were reinterpreted through this lens. Dragons, who were once wise guardians, became monsters to be defeated by Christian saints and heroes. The legend of Saint George and the Dragon exemplifies this transformation. Although the story is presented as a Christian victory over paganism, scholars suggest it may have its roots in much older traditions about the conflict between natural forces and human order. The dragon in this context would represent not only evil, but also the wild power of nature that must be domesticated by Christian civilization. Pagan festivals, transformed celebrations. Ancient European calendars were marked by seasonal festivals that celebrated the cycles of nature. These events, deeply rooted in agricultural experience and astronomical observation, were gradually Christianized or suppressed. Samhain, the ancient Celtic festival that marked the end of harvest and the beginning of the new year, is perhaps the best-known example of this transformation. During Samhain, it was believed that the veil between the world of the living and the dead was thinner, allowing communication with ancestors and spirits. Bonfires were lit to ward off evil spirits, and people wore disguises to confuse any hostile entities. The church initially tried to completely ban Samhain, denouncing it as a diabolical festival. When this approach proved ineffective, the strategy shifted to co-optation. All Saints' Day was strategically placed on November 1st, followed by All Souls' Day on November 2nd, in an attempt to Christianize traditional observances. Beltane, the fertility festival celebrated in early May, faced a similar fate. The traditions of dancing around maypoles, jumping over bonfires, and celebrating sexuality as nature's creative force were seen as particularly problematic by the medieval church. These rituals were gradually suppressed or transformed into more appropriate Christian festivals. The winter solstice, celebrated in cultures throughout the Northern Hemisphere, was perhaps the most successful transformation. Festivals like Yule, Germanic tradition, and Saturnalia, Roman tradition, were incorporated into Christmas celebrations, allowing many pagan traditions to survive under new Christian guise. Fairy tales and elemental beings. The world of fairy beings presented a particular challenge for Christian authorities. Fairies, elves, goblins, and other elemental beings were an integral part of European folklore, serving to explain inexplicable natural phenomena and providing a rich tradition of moralizing tales. These creatures did not fit easily into Christian cosmology. They were not human, but they were also not clearly angels or demons. Some stories portrayed them as benevolent, others as capricious, or even malevolent. Their existence, parallel to the human world, suggested a spiritual reality that competed with Christian explanations of the supernatural. The Church's response varied. Some theologians attempted to classify all fairies as disguised demons, explaining their apparent good deeds as attempts to deceive the faithful. Others suggested they were souls of unbaptized people, trapped in a liminal state between salvation and damnation. Stories of baby exchanges by fairies were particularly problematic. These legends, which may have served to explain developmental disabilities or sudden changes in children's behavior, suggested that non-Christian supernatural beings had direct power over baptized children. Such a concept challenged the divine protection that baptism supposedly offered. In Ireland and Scotland, traditions about fairy folk were so deeply rooted that complete suppression was impossible. Instead, the Church developed a complex theology that attempted to explain these experiences within a Christian framework, often portraying fairy encounters as tests of faith or demonic temptations. Shamanism and indigenous traditions. When European powers expanded their territories through colonization, Christian missionaries encountered spiritual systems completely different from those they were familiar with in Europe. The shamanic traditions of the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Oceania presented concepts of spirituality that were simultaneously fascinating and terrifying to medieval Christian minds. Shamanism, with its emphasis on direct communication with spirits, spiritual journeys, and healing through rituals, was universally denounced as diabolic. The shaman's ability to enter altered states of consciousness and allegedly travel to other worlds was interpreted as evidence of demonic possession. In the Americas, figures like Andean healers, North American tribal medicine men, and Amazonian shamans were systematically persecuted. Their knowledge of medicinal plants, astronomy, and healing techniques was labeled as witchcraft. Rituals involving the use of psychoactive plants for spiritual purposes were particularly condemned. The Spanish Church in Latin America developed an entire inquisitorial apparatus dedicated to eradicating indigenous idolatrous practices. Codices on sacred texts were burned, temples were destroyed, and traditional spiritual practices were forced underground. Many shamanic traditions survived only through syncretism with Christian symbols and saints. Alchemy and occult knowledge. Alchemy represents a fascinating case of knowledge that oscillated between acceptance and condemnation by the Church. Initially, many Christian scholars saw alchemy as a legitimate investigation of the secrets of divine creation. After all, if God had created the world with natural laws, studying and understanding these laws could be seen as an act of devotion. However, as alchemy developed, it began to incorporate elements that concerned religious authorities. The search for the philosopher's stone was not just about transmuting common metals into gold. It also involved the quest for a universal panacea and, some claimed, the conquest of physical immortality. Such ambitions seemed to usurp divine prerogatives. More problematic still was the fact that many alchemical texts incorporated symbolism and concepts derived from Hermetic, Gnostic, and pagan traditions. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus, supposedly the founder of alchemy, was clearly non-Christian. The writings attributed to him contained ideas about the divine nature of humanity and the possibility of spiritual transformation through occult practices. During periods of greater religious orthodoxy, alchemists were often persecuted as heretics or associated with witchcraft. Their laboratories were seen as dens of diabolic activity, and their experimental practices were interpreted as attempts to invoke demons or challenge the natural order established by God. The survival of forbidden folklore. Despite centuries of suppression and persecution, many of these forbidden folkloric traditions managed to survive. They adapted, transformed, and found new forms of expression. In some regions, they were preserved in secret, transmitted orally from generation to generation. In others, they were disguised under Christian symbols or incorporated into approved traditions. European rural folklore maintained many pagan elements well disguised. Fairy tales that originally spoke of ancient goddesses were transformed into stories about Christian saints, but the essential elements remained. Seasonal festivals continued to be celebrated, albeit under Christian names and theological justifications. Literature played a crucial role in preserving these traditions. Writers like the Brothers Grimm collected folktales that contained clearly pre-Christian elements. Although these stories were presented as innocent entertainment, they preserved ancient mythemes about transformation, journeys to other worlds, and magical powers. During the Enlightenment, and especially in the 19th century, there was a renewed academic interest in these primitive traditions. Anthropologists, folklorists, and mythologists began to systematically study the beliefs that the Church had tried to suppress. Paradoxically, this academic interest helped preserve traditions that might have been completely lost. The modern Renaissance. In modern times, many of these forbidden traditions have experienced a dramatic resurgence. The neo-pagan movement, which began in the 20th century, sought to revive and reconstruct ancient spiritual traditions. Wicca, modern Druidism, Asatru, reconstructed Norse religion, and other neo-pagan traditions gained followers worldwide. Simultaneously, there's been growing popular interest in mythology, folklore, and alternative spiritual traditions. Books, films, and other media have popularized figures and concepts that were once known only to specialized scholars. Dragons returned to being seen as symbols of wisdom and power. Witches were reinterpreted as healers and guardians of ancient knowledge. The New Age and alternative spiritual movements incorporated elements of shamanism, alchemy, and mystical traditions that had been suppressed for centuries. Practices like meditation, ritual use of crystals, astrology, and herbal medicine, all with roots in traditions the Church considered heretical, became mainstream in many Western societies. Lessons and reflections. The history of forbidden folklore teaches us several important lessons about the nature of human culture, religious power, and the persistence of popular traditions. First, it demonstrates how attempts to completely suppress deeply rooted traditions are rarely successful. Beliefs and practices that respond to fundamental human needs tend to find ways to survive, even under intense persecution. Second, this history reveals how definitions of heresy and orthodoxy are often determined by political and social considerations, as much as by genuine theological concerns. Many practices that were denounced as diabolic were simply different from the norms established by dominant authorities. Third, we see how competition between belief systems can lead to both creative synthesis and cultural destruction. While much traditional knowledge was lost, the encounter between Christian and pagan traditions also produced new forms of cultural and spiritual expression. Finally, this history reminds us of the importance of religious and cultural tolerance. Attempts to impose uniformity of belief through force often resulted in unnecessary suffering and the loss of invaluable cultural heritage. Conclusion: the enduring legacy. Forbidden folklore continues to exert a powerful influence on contemporary culture. Its images, themes, and concepts appear in literature, cinema, art, and modern spiritual practices. The enduring fascination with witches, dragons, fairies, and mystical traditions suggests that these stories touch something fundamental in human experience. More importantly, the study of these suppressed traditions helps us better understand our own cultural history. They represent alternative voices that marginalized or silenced, but which still have something important to teach us about different ways of understanding the world and our place in it. When examining these stories with modern eyes, we need not accept all their claims literally. Instead, we can appreciate them as creative expressions of human imagination, as attempts by our ancestors to make sense of an often mysterious and unpredictable world. They remind us that there are many forms of knowledge and wisdom, and that diversity of perspectives enriches our collective understanding of human experience.
Forbidden folklore is not just ancient history, it is a living reminder of the richness and complexity of human culture. Its stories continue to inspire, provoke, and challenge our assumptions about reality, spirituality, and humanity's place in the cosmos. In that sense, perhaps the real heresy would be to completely ignore these voices from the past and the wisdom they may still offer to the modern world.